Welcome back. As leaders beginning to arrive in Hangzhou, China for the 2016 G20 Summit, we're previewing what the world leaders will be discussing in the coming days. Joining us now for this part of the program from Beijing, Victor Gao, the Chinese international relations expert and director of the China National Association of International Studies, and also from New Delhi, Varaprasad Dolla, the chair of the Center for East Asian Studies at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. With me in the studio, Tamim Bayoumi is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and an international economist on leave from the International Monetary Fund. Thanks so much for joining us, all of you. Victor, I have to start with you in Beijing. Obviously, a sort of sense of excitement in China that it is hosting for the first time G20 Summit. What does China hope to get out of it in terms of its standing in the global economy?
Yes, indeed. This G20 summit meeting in Hangzhou, which will start there in about 2 days' time, is the most important bilateral international event that China is hosting. And for all the other G20 summits before, the hosting country will play a very important role. China is no exception. I'm pretty sure China will do a solid job in terms of organizing all the details. But as far as the substantive issues are concerned, I think China will very much promote a more consensus-based view to further increase the governance side of the equation as far as international trade and economic development and financial matters are concerned. China, after all, is the second largest economy next only to the United States, but if we use purchasing power parity as the benchmark, China is already the largest economy. Therefore, China's role will be important not only as a participant, but this time as the chairing nation and also as a great contributor to the economic development around the world. And I think the world will be watching what China will do, and I hope China will live up to the expectation, not only in hosting this one, but also leading the way in promoting governance and standard setting for global economic development in the future.
Varaprasad Dolla in New Delhi, obviously innovation part of it, inclusiveness, we're talking about the 4 I's again. There's another one you could put in there if you wanted to, infrastructure. How important of a departure is this G20 summit from others when it tries to tackle the long-term, or at least medium-term, economic challenges of the globe, not necessarily short-term financial crises?
I think a great role that China is going to play in addressing the global downturn is something that is seen across the world as something that many countries do feel that this is going to be a game changer, especially given the manner in which the infrastructure, particularly in the developing countries, has become so pivotal for maintaining the steady economic growth. So it is in this context, if we see that China, given its size of the economy, given its emphasis particularly on one road, one belt, and also on the AIIB, where China has been very keen on improving the infrastructure across Asia and the rest of the world. So therefore, the Chinese contribution to addressing the global downturn is something that is very pivotal in this context.
Tamim, I want to go to you. Obviously, you're on leave from the IMF. The IMF has been taking a lot of criticism in the last 10 years about not being as inclusive as it could, and it has been making reforms. Are we at that sort of pivotal stage where the G20 now are going to have much more influence on writing the rule book of the 21st century when it comes to economic governance? Are we in that post-Bretton Woods situation?
Well, I think that, a lot has already been done. In particular, there has been a change in quotas, which was quite important.
Yeah, explain that just for our audience.
Sorry. The IMF is run by governments, and each government puts in money, and that's what's called a quota, and that defines your voting share. So it's quite important how big your quota is. And for some time now, there's been, given the change in the world economy, there's been more voting power in the advanced countries than there has been in the emerging markets. And there was a big change some time ago which started to move the emerging markets up to where they should be, although it's still a long way from being complete.
What's been the effect of that? What reforms have we seen, and what will the G20 do to push that agenda forward?
Well, what it means is that the organization as a whole, you run by what your shareholders care about.
Absolutely.
And if you have an organization in which more developing countries have more voice, then clearly you focus on the issues that they're interested in, just as China is able to move the world economy, for example, in this G20 Summit, towards focusing much more on development than has been true before.
I want to go back to Victor on that point, because inclusiveness is one of the big agenda items here, and we're seeing Chad as head of the African Union being invited, Kazakhstan, Laos, others as well, to participate more fully in the process. What effects do you think that will have in terms of where the G20 agenda goes this weekend?
Well, if we look at the membership of the G20, there is only one African country, South
Africa,
Africa, as a member, and I think there are altogether more than 55 countries in Africa. Therefore, I think Africa is definitely underrepresented in G20. However, inviting the AU to sit in as an observer for the G20 proceeding will make sure that the spillover effect from the G20 will be shared by all the African countries, and this will enhance the inclusiveness, not only the member states of South Africa as a member of G20, but all the other African countries. And I think inclusiveness is important, not only for the different walks of life in one particular country, but indeed very much so for the G20 members, as well as those countries which are not G20 members. And hopefully in the future, G20 can also be enlarged, and countries like Egypt and Nigeria in Africa in particular could eventually qualify for new membership for G20. And I think China is playing very hard role in promoting this, so that G20 is not a closed door framework, it's more open-ended. More other countries will share the benefits of the consensus view coming out of the G20 summit.
Varaprasad, does India and others appreciate the sort of more focus on sustainable development and, of course, green initiatives as well going forward? Given, though, let's remember that growth isn't great at the moment, so there needs to be some sort of balance there, right?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the way in which both India and China have been grappling with the issue of maintaining a steady economic growth alongside ensuring sustainable development, focusing on green economy, and therefore both countries are committed to this very important initiative. As the global economy moves from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, this kind of a paradigm shift that the entire global community is taking quite seriously, and therefore the Indian contribution and the Chinese contribution is quite pivotal to make sure that we have a greener economy and a better world.
Tamim, I just want to perhaps point out a contrast here between what's going to be said at the G20 and what the reality might be in the world. We are seeing our former home country, Brexit, voting to leave the European Union. We're seeing calls for protectionism, trade protectionism here in the United States during the election, and also elsewhere. This sort of globalized sustainable development model, everyone moving together, may be great in Hangzhou over the weekend, but is that where global sentiment is?
Well, I think you're right that sort of the view of global cooperation has had a couple of dents. As you say, Brexit and the US election are very clear examples of that. I think that the more general issue is that the G20 has before called for international cooperation in order to boost growth. The Americans started this in the Pittsburgh Summit in 2009 when they started what was called the mutual assessment process, which was supposed to coordinate everybody's policies to create growth. Now that didn't really go very far. And then the Australians refined that into something much more specific about structural reforms. But again, that didn't go anywhere. And the reason for this is there was a sort of mutual non-aggression treaty across the G20, which is I won't complain about you if you don't complain about me. So the big question for the Chinese, I think, is how do they break out of that non-aggression treaty?
Well, let's put that to Victor Gao in Beijing. You've hinted that you want the G20 and China to be more inclusive and to be, let's face it, the main engine of economic decision-making going forward, more inclusive. But it doesn't have a staff. It doesn't have the trappings of the post-World War II institutions. Where would you like to see G20 post-Hangzhou, considering it's going to be so central?
Yes, indeed. If we look at the origin of G20, it came out of the ashes of the international financial crisis. And I think there was an immediate requirement for G20 to take impromptu actions to deal with all the fires, for example. However, now that we are in 2016 and China, which has emphasized on the long-term strategic view and handling economic development for the long term, for example, we want to promote a situation where there will be a lot of more strategic emphasis, long-term planning, for example, for the global economic development. In that sense, G20 could turn from a more reactive to piecemeal crisis-based events to a long-term strategic view into the future, beyond the horizon. And I think in this sense, China can really add value to promoting more kind of a standard setting, for example, and more based on rules, for example, and coordination among all the G20 member states, sharing of the information. In the future, I think, to set up a secretariat for the G20 will be a positive step. And also, I think, in the months that G20 summit is not happening, constant coordination, communication, setting up red lines for the G20 purposes so that leaders within the G20 can call each other at any time when there is a crisis, at any time when there is a flaring up of a genius ideas, for example. That will be very important. G20 should not only just focus on the year-to-year events. G20 should have the luxury of looking into the future, 5 years or 10 years into the future, and then use that kind of long-term vision to come back to guide the global economic developments on an annual basis.
Victor Gao, thanks so much. It's fascinating to watch the global economic architecture change before our very eyes. Victor Gao in Beijing, Varaprasad Dolla in New Delhi, thank you so much. And of course, Tamim Bayoumi here in the studio. Thanks for a great discussion. That's all we have time for.